You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're asking the important question, is Jaws a horror movie? Is Spielberg's 1975 classic actually a slasher under the surface? We're taking a deep dive to answer the question. Here we go. All right, Pete, so as we record, Jaws is celebrating its 50 years anniversary. And from what you've mentioned a few times, as we've recorded on many episodes of the Fan2Fan Podcast, which is what people are listening to, talking to Pete Charbonneau, co-host extraordinaire. I'm Bernie Gonzalez. Pete has mentioned a few times how he found himself in the back of a station wagon with a blanket over his head, hiding now, arguably, maybe, Pete, 50-some years ago, back when Jaws was released, June 20th, 1975.
Yeah, I don't want to date myself, but that was me hiding in the back of the station wagon, and cut to 50 years later, here I am, still hiding in the back of a station wagon.
There is a creature alive today who has survived millions of years of evolution without change, without passion, and without logic. It lives to kill. A mindless eating machine. It will attack and devour anything. It is as if God created the devil and gave him jaws.
Yeah, I've talked about it many times before. Jaws, a seminal event in my young life. Gave me that healthy fear of sharks when I was younger, but really more fascination for sharks, and something that I've still kind of fascinated by the whole idea of it. Yeah, I mean, 50 years, it's kind of incredible. And it's kind of incredible to kind of get the chance to revisit it from time to time, because sometimes, movies like that are just like such standard bearers on any number of levels. I know some people are probably a little more religious about, like, I have to watch it every year or this and that, like, not really that way. But when the mood does strike me, I feel kind of privileged that I've actually seen Jaws, I guess, 3 times in the theater now, because once when I was a kid, way too young, and then they played it at the Coolidge Corner Theater when I was living in Boston. Don't remember if it was sold out. If it wasn't, it was like close to sold out. And, that's another great old indie theater. What an experience that was, because you just had like the whole energy of the crowd that's so well, versed and so familiar with the film that, like, you can almost feel the anticipation rising for certain scenes. It was great. And then just recently, a couple of weeks ago, with Universal re-releasing it for the 50th anniversary, I was playing at the Carolina Theater, and so I was like, well, I gotta experience it in the theater again. So I did. Spoiler alert, it's pretty good. It's a pretty good movie.
Jaws 50th, that's the anniversary this year, became an instant classic. I remember hearing Quentin Tarantino once kind of say that in his perspective, he thought that Jaws was like the perfect movie, maybe the best movie of all time.
I think Jaws is the greatest movie ever made. Maybe not the greatest film, but it's the greatest movie ever made.
I actually think Jaws is the greatest movie ever made. Not the greatest film ever made, but what's supposed to be a movie, everything that a movie is supposed to be, You're never going to get better than Jaws. Jaws is the pinnacle of that. It's the greatest movie ever made.
And I think that was Tarantino distinguishing Jaws, not a film, but a movie. So maybe separating it from like the group picture with Citizen Kane or like Seven Samurai, where it's like, if those are films, Jaws is a movie. By his definition, maybe the greatest movie of all time. And I think kind of leaning into that, whether or not you agree with Tarantino's definition or not, I think it at least might make for a good conversation to talk about what kind of genre, movie genre, what category Jaws belongs in. So I'm going to make a case for a few, Pete. So let's start with Jaws is a drama at its core, character-driven human drama that really focuses on human struggles, personal fear, and greed.
100%, especially when you get to the portion of the film when they're on the Orca, and then you've got the 3, I guess you would call them main characters, because of basically the film at that point focuses on them, and you've got 3 flawed individuals that are out in the elements, pitted up against a force of nature, but it's that chunk of the movie is very much a character study of those three men. Yeah.
The thing that we all know about this movie is how Bruce, the mechanical shark, wasn't working.
Also flawed. Yes.
Also flawed. But I think I've seen in some documentaries where like Spielberg, and maybe this only comes with hindsight 50 years later, and he starts to connect the dots that some of those flaws, the character-driven piece of it, was only likely possible because they just had a lot of fucking spare time on boats where they could do nothing else because the shark wasn't working. And then when you're a filmmaker, a young filmmaker at that, and you're literally on a boat with a crew and you're trying to find something, then you just keep shooting more character stuff. And again, not to not give Spielberg credit, but it found its way to the screen and then reinforces the argument Jaws could be a drama. But it could also be a thriller because it certainly builds tension, suspense through the pacing, through the music, and again, the unseen shark. But all of that in many ways actually ramps up the tension because we don't see Bruce the shark to really make it potentially a thriller.
Fully agree. A movie that builds tremendous tension to the point where just my personal opinion and my personal preference is modern films that are able to build that kind of tension. Those are the movies that I really gravitate towards when I'm talking about like a serious, like if I want to be scared. It's like, the jump scares, like whatever, it's a cheap effect. It has its place, but a film that can really ratchet up the tension to me seems kind of rare in this day and age, but ones that do it really owe a huge debt to what Spielberg did in Jaws, I feel, because it's a real masterclass in building up something, again, allowing you to use your imagination against you in a lot of ways because you don't see the shark for the longest time, but it's there. The POV shots of the unsuspecting swimmers and bathers tapping into primal fear in a way that few films, few directors, few productions are able to do.
And I love that you said primal fear because there's another category that Jaws could fall into. And we both saw the documentary and we had an episode about it, Sharksploitation. And I think you could argue Jaws is an exploitation flick, certainly for the sharksploitation genre, like the grandpappy of the genre, because albeit having like a Hollywood budget, so it doesn't have like the cheap grindhouse New York 42nd Street style budget, but the shark attack used to shock audiences. You get blood, you get brief nudity, but there is some, a lot less than you might see in other exploitation flicks. But in a lot of ways, you could argue it is an exploitation flick.
Yeah, you get a child mauled on a raft. Again, sometimes it's still kind of shocking, but like you could really have to put yourself back into when this movie came out in the mid 70s and it was PG. And granted, there was no PG-13 at that point, but this was a PG rated film. You don't see a ton, but you definitely see a geyser of blood shooting up out of Alex Kintner when he's attacked in that scene. So I would certainly call that exploitative. Roger Corman had a quote that I'm not going to get 100% accurate, so I'm going to paraphrase, but he got tagged with being like an exploitation director quite a bit, but he kind of wore it as a badge of honor because he's like, well, I'm just taking something that the audience is interested in and exploiting that. It's like, so yes, I am into exploitation, but I think he was trying to take back some of the negative connotations of what exploitation films meant. But I kind of like that he did that and kind of just owned what he did.
Yeah, whatever slight was maybe meant by someone calling him that, he took the bug and made it a feature. And like you said, badge of honor. I am an exploitation film producer and director. And if anything, like I'm happy to have earned that moniker.
And didn't he produce one of the Jaws knockoffs?
I mean, he certainly produced Piranha, directed by Joe Dante.
There you go. Yeah.
Water. You can drink it. You can swim in it. And if you're not careful, you can die in it. Piranha. Piranha. The deadliest flesh eaters of all. Their razor teeth can strip a man to bone in seconds. And now they're here in the lakes and rivers of America. Piranha. They'll eat you alive. From New World Pictures, rated R, under 17, not admitted without parent.
what Gator and Piranha are to Jaws, they're certainly kissing cousins because they only exist because of that idea. And that's where I think this next one, let's bring the Carolina Theater again. When we were talking to Jim Carroll, who's the senior director of programming at the Carolina Theater in Durham, he had mentioned how he programs retro films, double features, usually Friday nights, and he always kind of tries to put together a theme. And when he was talking about things that he programs for that retro series, whether it's that, Splatterfest, or Kaiju Quest, he kind of just threw out there Jaws. And that was an interesting way of also looking at Jaws, not as a drama or thriller or an exploitation flick, but as a creature feature or maybe even kaiju movie where you have the Jaws as like this, I mean, almost like supernatural force, the way it's portrayed in the film, larger than any other shark in existence, where it has the classic like creature feature formula where, you know, the beast emerges, it wreaks havoc. You need a bunch of heroes. Like you mentioned, the 3 characters that need to basically come together, hunt down this menace. It seems to check all those boxes as a creature feature.
Sure. I mean, how many more feet do you need to go till it turns into, like, a rubber suited monster type film? Yeah. I mean, the classic line when Richard Dreyfuss is like watching it swim by the boat, he's like,
"That's a 20-footer.
25. 3 tons on them."
That's right. Because, if you're going to have, an ape or a gorilla climb the Empire State Building, it's got to be bigger than life. And that's what Jaws is, a bigger than life great white shark that in some ways kind of stretches credibility. Sharks aren't that big. They shouldn't be that big. But by stretching it just enough, and I think even in one of the documentaries, Pete, like that line you were talking about, where I think either in the book or in the screenplay, it was even bigger, like, it was a 32, but Spielberg thought, no, guys, we don't need to go that far, because if we actually just add a few more feet to it, it makes it still feel like it's possible, and people aren't going to suspend their disbelief so much that it's not King Kong. It's like, oh no, this shark is just a little bigger. Okay, well, that's not unbelievable.
And so much so that stuck in my head when I saw it as a kid, because I took that as, well, why would a movie lie to me? So I was thinking like, oh yeah, great whites can be like 20 to 25 feet long. And then when I got into studying them and reading about them and kept hearing about like great whites rarely grow larger than 20 feet. And it was disappointing to me because I had this idea of like, ooh, great white shark, this giant fish swimming in the ocean. I just, and I'm like, my perspective and imagination just had them being like 25, 30 feet long, but it's like, that's just not the case. And it took me a really long time to get over that. So thanks, Steven Spielberg, and thanks, Peter Benchley.
And I think all of these different arguments of what Jaws could be, where would it be in the blockbuster aisle if it technically could be shoehorned pretty easily into any of those different categories? If you could argue all of those, you could also argue Jaws could be a horror movie. So it could be in the horror category.
Halloween, the motion picture about the most terrifying night of the year, starring Donald Pleasance.
I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up, because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
Halloween, the night he came home. Rated R.
So Jaws comes out in 1975. 3 years later, Halloween becomes one of the most profitable independent films ever made at that time. It made horror legitimate, Halloween did. It made it a profitable genre for a lot of producers who, as we well know, took advantage of it. And more specifically, I think it created just a formula. And then you get Friday the 13th, or you give him a sweater and you get Freddy. Every permutation that after Halloween codified the slasher formula, right? You get the POV shots that Carpenter did so well in that intro shot in the first movie. We get the term of the final girl that makes it through all of the ordeal. And if Halloween is kind of the blueprint, didn't Jaws in some way check the boxes for a lot of those same tropes of the killer being a slasher? And in this case, it just happens to be a shark.
Yeah, Jaws is certainly a horror movie. And I was on, as I'm wont to do, to just kind of stroll through the fields of Reddit reading a Reddit thread about, is Jaws a horror movie? And there was like a lot of back and forth on it. And it was like, okay, I'm like, this is a fun, lively dialogue that I'm in no way going to take part in, but I will read it and enjoy the responses. Because some people are like, no, it's an adventure movie and it's like, it's a character study. But if you want to call it a horror movie, I'm like, yes, it very much is. You know, the opening of Jaws with Chrissy swimming and she gets attacked, you see so many of the horror movies that came after that kind of really taking that opening scene vibe and feel to kind of just set you up for whatever they're going to throw at you later. I'm sure there's people out there, and I'm sure that there's films that have done this before Jaws, but I feel like, again, like, because Jaws set the template and really changed the game in terms of blockbuster, I think it started a lot that filmmakers took note of, whether you want to call it copying, whether you want to call it an homage. They kind of ran with that template because it's effective.
Chrissy's midnight swim scene that gave us a little bit of a cue into what we were going to get into. We see it with a young Michael Myers in Halloween. Every Friday the 13th, in some ways, starts with that initial stalking and killing just to give us a bit of a sense, and then put Jaws under the same microscope. It's all there. The idea of the stalking, the faceless, unseen villain, all of these things kind of check off the boxes. And in some ways, like, really drawing the line between Jaws and Halloween. In Jaws, Miss Kittner goes to Chief Brody and has this line.
Chief Brody?
Yes?
I just found out that a girl got killed here last week. And you knew it. You knew there was a shark out there. You knew it was dangerous. But you let people go swimming anyway. You knew all those things. But still, my boy is dead now.
And a good parallel to that, in Halloween, Sheriff Brackett says to Dr. Loomis,
Doctor, do you know what Haddonfield is? Families, children, all lined up in rows up and down these streets. You're telling me they're lined up for a slaughterhouse?
They could be.
All right, I'll stay with you tonight. Just in the chance that you're right. And if you are right, damn you for letting him go.
Going into both of those lines, how they both also kind of echo that idea of like institutional failure. The sheriff is supposed to protect the people in Halloween. He's trying to do that. But this doctor, because of his failure in taking care of his patient, now the sheriff is, has to react to a murder on his streets. Just like Mrs. Kittner being like, you knew there was a shark out there and you knew it was dangerous and you didn't do anything about it. The institution has failed us.
It's the upending of all the things. And again, I'm going back into the time period of the 70s and then the early 80s. It's upending those places that so many, I'll say people, but I might more specifically mean Americans, felt very safe in. The suburbs, until stranger danger comes along. Nightmare on Elm Street, another great example of that, kind of takes that page from Halloween, where it's like you think this is just a nice quiet suburban community, but there's some guy invading our kids' dreams and killing them in their sleep. As parents, some of which turns out had a hand in bringing all that about. But it's like, what do you do that as a parent? Like, how do you protect your kids when they're sleeping, they're not safe? And Jaws in the 70s, like there was such a back to nature push of like going camping, which ties into the Friday the 13th. They're going to send my kid off to camp and there's nothing crazy is going to happen there. They're just going to have a nice couple of weeks out in the woods and hopefully learn some survival skills. And, I guess they're going to learn a little too pointedly survival skills because there's a either sackcloth or hockey mask wielding killer in there.
I promise. Go lie down. Stay there.
What do you think?
I think we're dead meat. Real dead meat.
So, what were you going to be when you grew up?
The spaghetti streets, the cul-de-sacs that made Haddonfield a slaughterhouse. You put Michael Myers in the suburbs, it becomes even more dangerous because then it becomes a bit of a turkey shoot. That's kind of what Jaws is, because we get Chrissy's death, like you mentioned, you get Alex Kittner who gets killed on the raft, you get the fishermen in the estuary, but there is this idea of helplessness where the people are on this island and there's so many of them coming in for the season, but they also aren't free to enjoy the beaches and enjoy a swim because there's an escalation happening. And that's increasing the stakes. Again, things that you find in horror movies.
And in that case, it's like the switch is like really flipped jarringly because, again, like I'll go back to that opening scene with Chrissy. Like she has no worries of going swimming at night in the water. There's no trepidation. There's no like, oh, maybe I shouldn't do this. Like, she's perfectly comfortable jumping in for a midnight swim. Like, why would anything happen to me? I'm a good swimmer. There's no danger here until there is. It's really about that breakdown and that shattering of the safe spaces that, we all were, I guess, by these films showing us we're under the illusion of being safe, that maybe they weren't so safe after all. And maybe you need to be a little more mindful of the places that you're stepping in, even places that seem completely safe and innocuous.
Excuse me,
Oh,
Laurie.
Mr. Brackett, I'm sorry, Mr. Brackett.
Oh, I didn't mean to startle you.
That's all right.
It's Halloween. I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
So if we got the slasher killer trope, the victims being picked off one by one trope, isolated setting, let's throw another trope in there, the final girl trope. In this case, Chief Brody, who essentially becomes the final girl, the final survivor, and he's kind of forced to face off against the shark alone after Quint's devoured, and Hooper
just hanging out the bottom of the ocean.
And by that argument, right, like then Brody becomes resourceful, ends up shooting the air tank. He survives. Well, Laurie Strode, right? She has to like outwit, outsmart, outlast Michael Myers. Friday the 13th, Alice survives Jason's bomb. Jaws, by all of those measures, also checks that box.
Yeah. One thing that I was thinking about, because I was thinking as Jaws as a whole, like, does it work as a horror movie as a whole? And I think it does. But I think that middle piece becomes Quint, Brody, and Hooper actively, we have to now track down the shark. So now they become the active pursuance of the killer. How often does that happen in horror movies? I guess I wouldn't even call it a trope because it doesn't happen very often. The one thing that came to my mind a little bit was like Nancy finally having enough of Freddy's shit and kind of setting the traps for him. Like, I'm going to go after you now, motherfucker, because you're killing all my friends and I really need a good night's sleep.
You didn't sleep at all last night, did you? The doctor says you have to sleep or you'll go even crazier. I don't think you're crazy. And stop drinking that damn coffee. You'll feel better when you get some sleep.
Feel better? You call this feeling better?
Screw sleep!
It's interesting. You do get a little bit of it's not the flipping of the script, and it's not dismissal. There's an element, I won't call it supernatural because it's not supernatural, but there's an element of, again, like these men on the orcas lived experiences and preconceived notions about what they're up against kind of getting shattered in the moment. And it starts on the one scene where Quint, that awesome scene where he's just like sitting in the fighting chair, like biting his crackers, and you get the little tick, tick, tick of the line as something starts to grab it. And Hooper's like completely dismissive, where like Quint's like, oh, yep, this is it. This is the shark. And Hooper's like,
hey, Quinn, let it go. Hey, Hooper. Maybe a big yahoo in the lab, but out here they're just supercargo. If you don't want to backstroke home, you get down here. Maybe a marlin or a stingray, but it's definitely a game. Even fish, eh? Marlin, stingray, been through this piano wire. Don't you tell me my business again. You get back on the bridge. That doesn't prove a damn thing. Well, it proves one thing, Mr. Hooper. Proves that you wealthy college boys don't have the education enough to admit when you're wrong.
And then Quint later, he can't go down, not with 2 barrels, not with 3 barrels. I mean, he can't do it. And like, and as the audience, you're kind of brought into it as well, because you're like, okay, well, Quint's this experienced fisherman. Hooper is, from Woods Hole, so he's been studying sharks all his life. These guys have some semblance of things under control because they've experienced, and once that gets thrown out the window because this great white is not playing by any of the rules previously established, that's when you're just kind of like, oh boy, as an audience member, your experience with them where they're just kind of like, oh shit, maybe we're not quite as safe as we thought we were, because everything that we know about great whites and sharks from our experiences, none of that is proving true right now.
What's the point? Hooks and lines.
And that's another point that you'd brought up earlier that kind of connects to what you said now, is maybe that's also where Jaws kind of pushes the envelope of being a slasher, a horror film, because a child is killed. And that is something we typically do not see in the Friday the 13th and the Halloween films, where we do get Alex Kittner that is killed. That's kind of taboo for horror and slasher films. It really isn't something that's kind of part of a traditional 80s type slasher, and that seems to have not changed in the evolution. Like in Scream, it's still the teenagers. I Know What You Did Last Summer. All those films still kind of play it pretty close to the chest when it comes to the kind of tropes that it's playing with. But Jaws, one of those rare examples where we do get like a child victim. All right, so Freddy was a child murderer, but that's only ever shown in the past and kind of off screen. Yeah. Michael goes after babysitters, but they're high schoolers, even if they look a little older to be high schoolers.
Totally. Totally silly. Totally.
In one of the Friday the 13th movies, where there's actual the campers that are not sure if they're going to survive to grow up to be what they want to be. But Jason doesn't actually kill them. If anything, he is the young victim who dies. Jason is. So Alex Kittner's death, yes, this is definitely Jaws pushing the envelope. It's a very shocking moment, especially how it's kind of portrayed, the bloody aftermath like you were talking about, his mom's grief, all very real and put on the screen.
Yeah, and he's, the few lines of dialogue that he has, he's just like, oh, please, can't I just stay out in the water a little bit longer? Like you would get as the 80s went on, and even now, like I'm thinking of like those, like the Piranha remakes, like the Piranha, like Double D, that are way more tongue in cheek. They start introducing characters, and sometimes they're kids that are just like, they're designed to be so annoying that you want them to die. So like kind of what even like the teenagers became in the 80s, where they went from being kind of relatable to, at the very least, like, oh, these just seem like fun counselors, kids, whatever, high schoolers at Deborah Hill writing great dialogue for the females in Halloween. Like you weren't actively rooting against the characters until a certain point where all of a sudden it became like, that was the trope, was like, okay, every person in here is so stupid that they need to die. And if they're not stupid, they're just like active dicks and assholes that I want to die. And then it quickly became like wish fulfillment for the audience to have Freddy, Jason, Michael, like off these people because there's just such awful human beings, which is a really weird like switch and juxtaposition on how this all started.
Yes. So you check off all that. One more that I think kind of makes sense, an overall atmosphere of dread, specifically to music. A lot of the Mount Rushmore of horror movies, Psycho, The Exorcist, come on, Tubular Bells, they all have that sort of iconic, memorable score. Obviously, Jaws has that too, and all the music cues really just make it memorable, but also in some ways, again, just still kind of fit the idea of defining Jaws as a horror film, especially when you're looking at it through that lens.
I had always wanted to be in business with John Williams all my life. And when he said yes to Sugarland, we became friends, and obviously I wanted him to do every picture I ever made, and Jaws came second. When he finally played the music for me on the piano, he previewed the main Jaws theme. I expected to hear something kind of weird and melodic, and tonal but eerie and of another world, almost a bit like outer space, inside, inner space, under the water. And what he played me instead with two fingers on the lower keys was dun, 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 dun. And at first I began to laugh. I thought he had a great sense of humor. He was putting me on. And he said, no, that's the theme to Jaws. And I said, play it again. He played it again, and he played it again, and it suddenly seemed right. And John found a signature for the entire movie.
all these movies would be nothing without the music that informs the audience. It starts to instill that little gnawing thing in the back of your head that something bad is going to happen, and sometimes that could be done effectively with like the sharp music cue, but certainly in Jaws's case, it's the slow, lethargical buildup until that tempo increases, and then it's almost like your heart rate is increasing with the increasing tempo of John Williams' score.
Worked for Jason, worked for Michael, works for Jaws.
I mean, all those guys knew to work with good musicians.
And I think all of these tropes are not necessarily to convince anyone who's listening that we're making a stance. We're going to ban ourselves from those Reddit groups you were talking about, because we're saying, no, Jaws is and only is a horror film.
You and I should go in and tag team that Reddit thread. Be like, we are here to drop some knowledge on you internet people.
I think that just lends more credence to it being, what do they call it? Like a 4-quadrant movie. That's what has also helped Jaws become timeless, because it has so much appeal. Yes, you can just see it as a drama, as a creature feature. You could see it as a horror movie.
The shark was scheduled to make many more appearances according to the script, and when the shark wasn't ready, or when we tested it and it sunk, I just decided to shoot without the shark, and in a way I think it increased it twerked up the suspense of the movie, because you really didn't know where it was going to come from next, and rather than not seeing the shark every scene, instead I just played a lot of the fear from people in water, seeing their legs kicking, a point of view of the camera moving, or just seeing the surface of the water with nothing below. That's what I think turned the movie into more of an exercise of suspense than just a horror film.
So if you had had the shark when you wanted it, you probably would have had a different movie.
I probably would have had a movie that wouldn't have been as successful, I think.
But however you look at it, and with as many audiences that have looked at it fondly and have found something about it that they want to continue revisiting, it doesn't matter how you look at it. It could be any of those things. It's just a great movie.
Yeah. One other genre which we haven't even touched on, you could look at it as a tragedy, because, spoiler alert, shark blow up at the end.
Well, you son of a...